All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books welcomes British writer and historian Nino Strachey. Strachey will be in conversation with Left Bank Books owner Kris Kleindienst. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank our supporters, the supporters of Nino, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. Left Bank Books offers in-store shopping, curbside pickup, and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world even. We are happy to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or for your friends on our website at left-bank.com. I'll share a direct link as well. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating. It also supports Nino. So thank you so much for your support. I'm Shane Mullen. I'm the event coordinator for Left Bank Books. Left Bank Books produces hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, at the end of the event. So be sure to type your questions as a comment. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook and YouTube to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. We are producing a lot of hybrid events as well this winter. So a lot of our in-person programming is going out into the virtual world for you to be able to watch wherever you are. So if you are unable to join us here in St. Louis at the store or wherever the event is happening, we have some really fantastic events coming up. Lois Lowry is coming up in a couple weeks. So you can join our events from near or far. And you can watch our event calendar on our website for full details about upcoming events. I'm really excited for tonight's event, and I would like to introduce the fantastic owner of Left Bank Books, Kris Kleindienst. Kris has been a bookseller for 47 years in the history of Left Bank Books, which has been in operation for 53 years. So we are so happy to have Kris. She is a past member of the ABA and has influenced booksellers near far for years, including myself. And I am so happy and thrilled that she will be in conversation with Nino this evening. Kris, off to you.
Thank you, Shane. And hello to everybody out there. It's really a thrill to be on a screen with you again. It's been a while. I'm very excited about tonight's conversation. Let me sort of set this up for you about the book a little bit. In the years before the First World War, a collection of writers and artists, Virginia Woolf, E.M. Forster, and Nino Strachey, among them, began to make a name for themselves in England and America for their irreverent spirit and provocative works of literature, art, and criticism. They called themselves the Bloomsbury Group, and by the 1920s, they were at the height of their influence. Then a new generation stepped forward. Creative young people who tantalized their elders with their captivating looks, bold ideas, and subversive energy. Young Bloomsbury, the book we're celebrating tonight, introduces us to this colorful cast of characters, including novelist Eddie Sackville-West, who wore elaborate makeup and dressed in satin and black velvet, artist Stephen Tomlin, who sculpted the heads of his male and female lovers, and author Julia Strachey, who wrote a searing tale of blighted love. Talented and productive, these larger-than-life figures had high-achieving professional lives and extremely complicated emotional lives. The group had always celebrated sexual equality and freedom in private, feeling that every person had the right to live and love the way they chose. But as transgressive self-expression became more public, this younger generation gave old Bloomsbury a new voice, revealing an aspect of history not yet explored, and with effervescent detail, Young Bloomsbury celebrates an open way of living and loving that would not be embraced for another 100 years. Author Nino Strachey is the last member of the Strachey family to have grown up at Sutton Court in Somerset, home of the family for more than 300 years. After studying at Oxford University and Courtauld Institute, Nino worked as a curator for the National Trust and English Heritage. She is also the author of Rooms of Their Own, has some projects I hope we have time to talk about going on right now. And she currently lives in West London with her husband and child. I am so excited and thrilled to be in conversation with you. Please welcome Nino Strachey to the studio.
Hi, hello. So glad to be with you tonight, and particularly as you're surrounded by books by Woolf and others, right in your room. So it's great to be with you here, Kris.
So it's great to be with you, and I'll let folks know it's like midnight where you are. So thank you so much for staying up late and talking with us. Let's start off with just how you came to write this book. You obviously have a treasure trove of legacy that you are surrounded by, but you can do whatever you want with that. But why? What moved you to put this amazing book together?
Okay, well, back in 2018, I was writing a book about the interiors created by 3 writers associated with the Bloomsbury Group, and that was called Rooms of Their Own. It was about Virginia Woolf, her lover Vita Sackville-West, and Vita's first cousin, Eddie Sackville-West. And I think it was safe to say that obviously at that point, I knew very well that my relation, Lytton Strachey, was a founding member of the Bloomsbury Group. But what I didn't know until I did that project was about his much younger cousin, John Strachey. And it wasn't until I was researching Eddie Sackville-West that I realized that John had been Eddie's best friend at school and at university, and they'd shared a flat together in London in the 20s. And what was amazing about that is when they'd moved out of that flat in 1926, they'd literally just gone along and shoveled all the papers into a tin trunk. And so sitting at Knowle in Kent, where Eddie, the Sackville-West family came, was this treasure trove of really personal and intimate papers, wonderful letters. And what was amazing about reading, these were letters written 100 years ago between young men and young women. And it was men talking very openly about their love for each other and young women talking about love for other women. And I just suddenly had this world, this vision into a new generation of much younger people getting together with the older members of the Bloomsbury Group. And I really felt that this was a story I wanted to share and to learn more about. And particularly something that I thought would be of interest to my child, who identifies as queer and non-binary. And it was a lovely chance for us to look into not just the queer heritage of the Bloomsbury Group, but the queer heritage of our own family, the Stracheys, going back into the 19th century, and just a lovely chance to look at queer role models and really modeling acceptance across different generations.
That's just fantastic. How personal that is for you, not just, in history of your family, but in the contemporary time. And, I think I mentioned this when we were emailing, but that when I was a teenager, I thought that my mother was a lesbian. Well, I found out she was a lesbian, and I was very disturbed. I didn't know what to do with this information, and I tried to find something to read, anything. And at that point, the only thing I could find was Oscar Wilde's book De Profundis, which he wrote while he was, if folks don't know, in prison for loving the wrong man. And he was just like the previous generation before the Woolfs and the Strachey. But that was a very dark introduction to the world of homosexuality, if you will. And but I soon came out and made my chosen family of my own. But to have, and nowadays we have like so much literature, like just this amazing, just bursting of creativity around gender and sexuality. But there's something about having that knowledge of the past, of like, we exist in time, that we're not these odd anomalies, but like there is this deep connection. So I think that's such an important thing that you've done by pulling this together.
but it felt like such an important thing for me to be able to celebrate that wonderful, well, just as you say, the positive aspects of a family of choice.
Mm-hmm.
And in thinking of Bloomsbury, I mean, it's really interesting looking at the different ways the Bloomsbury Group has been looked at over the last 100 years. And often there's been almost a sense of what I would describe as sort of prurient voyeurism, looking at their lives and relationships. And actually I was thinking, hang on, this is such a positive thing. This is a group of queer friends and allies who came together in the early 1900s. And then in the 20s, were nurturing this new generation of queer young writers and artists, giving them a place and a space where they could be themselves, feel accepted for who they were, nurture their various talents. And this in a context of a time when often their biological families were encouraging them to go for conversion therapy. And it's extraordinary looking at how many members of the younger group, of the Bloomsbury Group, were sent, for example, to Germany to go through courses of injections and psychotherapy. One young man, Stephen Tennant, who's an artist, was sent to a psychiatric hospital for a year of isolation treatment. And yet, in the Bloomsbury Group, they could find a group of adults who would, as I say, accept them for who they were. And that was just such a positive thing, and also a lovely way to celebrate this continuous history of support for trans and non-binary identities, in a way that is, when you're talking about that history 100 years ago, just affirms that continuing identity and existence.
It's just remarkable. I feel like I'm almost just like fangirling. I had not realized that. I did not know about the conversion therapy until I read your book, and I'm not sure how I missed that, or if I forgot something somewhere. When I was back in the day, we talked about like the work of Kraft Ebing and the early scientists and medical people trying to wrap their heads around homosexuality. But you write about that in the book, and I just had not realized that. And so they weren't, the Bloomsbury Group weren't like political activists. It's but they were doing this incredible cultural work.
Absolutely. And I think what's interesting, as you say, they weren't necessarily campaigning for social change in that way, but by living their lives and expressing their support and encouraging others to be provocative in their artistic and literary outputs, they were nurturing change, I think, in their own way, and also helping to bring through different ways of thinking and being, and playing a pioneering role in the UK in the development of Freudian thought as well. If you think of Lytton's brother, James Strachey, who was the first translator of Freud into English. And I think one of the fascinating things about looking at this new young generation is how many of them were receiving Freudian analysis during this period. And that includes the pair of young American lovers, Henrietta Bingham and Mina Kirsten, who Henrietta had come to England with her professor at Smith. They were involved in a relationship with each other. They were being analysed in London by Freudian analysis, and actually reports of their sessions were being sent back to Freud in Vienna as well, which is extraordinary. And so they were introduced to the Bloomsbury Group and encouraged to explore a whole range of different relationships with men and women, and to really to help develop. And I think they had a great time while they were in the UK, I hope.
So remarkable. When you bring up the Americans, it reminds me that I wanted to mention or ask, you touch on it a little in the book, that there was something different but similar, analogous, parallel happening in Paris kind of around the same time. There were these salons, we know, Gertrude Stein and Natalie Clifford Barney had a very different kind of salon going on. Wealthy American women, I'm more familiar with the women in Paris than other stuff, but were, coming there as well. And was there much interaction? Sort of, how do you feel like can you talk about how you think they're different and
Well, I think there were these fascinating cross currents of connections, as you say, running between these different communities, particularly in Paris, in London, in Berlin, and New York. And I think there's one particular person who I wrote about and researched for the book, Esther Murphy, who was the sister of the American artist Gerald Murphy, who's best known really as being the inspiration for Dick Diver in Tender as the Night. And both Esther and Gerald were great friends of Scott Fitzgerald, obviously. And Esther was, lived in New York, went to live in Paris, was in love with Natalie Barney, so was in part of that salon in Paris. And then when in New York, ran into John Strachey, who was over in New York lecturing at exactly the time that Lytton Strachey's book Elizabeth and Essex was coming out in New York. And so there was a bit of a buzz around him, I think. Anyway, they came together and they married. And here, again, I mean, John absolutely knew that Esther was bisexual. He knew that she had been in relationships with women and continued to be. Obviously, John had lived with Eddie Sackville West, who had relationships with men. And so they had this, I think, amazing cross-cultural relationship. And I think one of my favorite discoveries during the book was that John and Esther had their honeymoon in 1929 at the Villa America in Cap d'Antibes, where Gerald and Sarah Murphy lived. And I'd kind of hoped to find out that they'd met Scott Fitzgerald when they were on honeymoon, but I hadn't have any evidence. And then I read Scott Fitzgerald's personal ledger for that period. And sure enough, August 1929, Fitzgerald puts that he's met Strachey's and Murphy's in Antibes. So yes, absolutely, they were honeymooning with Scott and Zelda. So I thought, amazing.
You've got some really stellar genealogies to draw connections with. Most of us are lucky if we find out that our grandfather owned a little shop or something. But that is just remarkable. I mean, because these people were so influential and they in culture and
sharing these cross currents between all, we've got the lost generation of writers going from American writers going from America to Paris and then connecting through to London. It felt like the 20s was this sudden outpouring of what we would now think as almost sort of countercultural art, literature, relationships, and taking advantage of all these great new things that were happening there, whether that was in technology or whether it was in dance and art and literature. And it was really an outpouring that sadly came to an end with the start of the Depression in the 30s and the rise of fascism. It was a magical moment, I think.
I certainly hope our 20s can, of the 2020, 20s, it can duplicate that fertile, creative, and expansive world without being bookended by the rise of fascism. There's some interesting parallels there too, but maybe we can learn something from, in part, just looking at this past. So I'm wondering, you started this work kind of with a purpose and somewhat by stumbling on some materials and all these different families that are involved between the Wolf side and the Strachey side and the Sackville Wests and the all of the others. And it was the time, of course, when these were people who were constantly keeping journals and writing letters. So so much material. How did you? And some of it is being accidentally stored, apparently, like folks don't really know what they have or what to do with it. So what were the family responses when you started doing this?
Well, I think it was a really wonderful journey of discovery for me, connecting with all the various descendants and relations, just as you say, of all the figures involved in Bloomsbury. And what was really heartening was I got such a positive response I mean, I think particularly one of my most treasured moments was from Vita Sackville West's granddaughter, Juliet Nicholson, who just said that she felt that this was a chance to look at what had felt like familiar material, just in a totally new way, and actually, hopefully, in a more positive way. And I had other family members, for example, Bunny Garnett's relative. Bunny Garnett owned the Bloomsbury bookshop where many of the older Bloomsbury members met members of the new generation. And he was just incredibly helpful to me in connecting me with material related to the bisexual sculptor Stephen Tomlin, who married Julia Strachey. And because Bunny Garnett was also bisexual, or probably actually I think we would think pan now, because he said he loved a person regardless of what gender they happened to be, and so that shared images and material and insights. And I think it was an interesting journey to go on with those family members, because I think in the beginning I probably thought I would be more looking at the creative and the literary and the artistic influence, and how it was so interesting. You had a group of older writers and artists meeting a group of young people who were familiar with all the new things that were going on, like broadcasting on the radio and appearing in colour supplements and popular magazines. And I thought I'd be talking about how they helped to make Bloomsbury popular. And actually, the journey I went on was looking much more at this role as the family of choice, and how they helped each other in a wonderful symbiotic way. And luckily, everybody seemed to really appreciate that, and helped look for material related to it.
That's fantastic. That, especially considering how you're, this is really celebrating their gender expression and their sexualities and as all these books have been written, so many of them just kind of silo these artists and writers, and everybody else is sort of tangential, and they minimize any reference to their sexuality, or they certainly don't explore it. And gender identity, forget it. So so that it seems like a really bold step to come to somebody who's holding the papers of an elder, and saying, we're gonna talk frankly here, and that they were okay with that. That's hopeful.
They really were. And I think, it was obviously so important, particularly for Virginia Woolf, and in thinking about how she shaped her character Orlando, who is obviously lives for 400 years and changes their gender over time, and thinking about how Virginia used the group of young people she was getting to know in the 20s. These were people who were 20 in the 20s, and like Eddie Sackville West, were experimenting with makeup, which was now commercially available for the first time, so that you could easily buy lipstick and powder and eyeshadow, whether you were identifying as male or female, and be choosing to wear that. And that obviously comes through in the characterization of Orlando, in what she described as, it's a combination of, Vita, but obviously of the painted boys who she met. Oh, I've just seen a cat disappear. Sorry. There we go.
We'll suggest another location here, but
yeah.
So
so a bit of, I think hopefully what also it brings is a sense of some of the joy that there was in this group. And I particularly, for those who might think of Virginia Woolf as maybe a sort of sober and judgmental person, possibly, it was a real pleasure to bring out her sense of fun, how she loved to tease people, particularly how she and Lytton would sort of riff off each other, and how she loved to invite attractive young men to tempt Lytton to her parties. and how she would always be thinking of the needs of those around her and be looking into their emotional lives. And Eddie Sackville West, she even suggested that he bring his diaries round to her house in Tavistock Square and read through them so that she could help him with all his difficult relationships with other young men. So it was a treat to get into that side of Virginia.
So was that kind of one of the discoveries of reading through the materials, the diaries in particular, that, I mean, I don't know how much of this has been, I mean, I know a lot of Virginia Woolf's diaries and letters have been published, but I don't actually know if all of them have. And
I think with Woolf, absolutely they have. But what was interesting is what people choose to thematically analyze. And for whatever reason, that aspect of her life hasn't necessarily been so thoroughly explored. And I think one of the new things for me was obviously because you have this amazing correspondence between Lytton and Virginia and the batting back and forth of the gossip. But what I had never looked at before was the absolute reams of letters to Lytton that are kept at the British Library from all the members of Young Bloomsbury. So this is the group who were 20s, in their 20s. And they are just so open and honest, and there are hundreds of them there. And these range from people like Rafe Partridge. Obviously, Lytton lived in what we describe today as a polyamorous throuple with the painter Dora Carrington and Rafe Partridge, who worked for Woolf at the Hogarth Press. And there are these lovely tender letters from Rafe and poems, one of which I quote in the book, where he talks about what a treat it is to be Lytton's boy and how it's wonderful that Lytton has a choice of 2 pillows to lie on, Dora or Rafe. And then young journalists like the Vogue journalist Raymond Mortimer, who just was described in Vogue as being vivacious in transparent celluloid. Gives you an idea of his amazing themes. And he was writing long letters to Lytton, suggesting all the parties that he and Lytton could arrange. These would start at 10:40 in the evening. So you would go on to dinner, you would have dinner and then go to a show and then you'd go to the party. And these would be groups of male beauties. And he sends great lists of people who he thinks would excite Lytton. And Virginia writes about these parties. Occasionally she would drop in because Raymond lived just around the corner from her. And she describes, images of Stephen Tennant being passed round in a toga, in an attitude, and the conversation that would be going on. And so I think those were some of the interesting things that came along.
Indeed. This is closest to being a fly on the wall at these parties as one can get. You definitely bring these things alive in the book. I mean, the source materials that you have, these primary source materials with their diaries and their letters are just incredible. And as you say, the reading of stuff that's been looked at and analyzed and quoted from the way you characterize it, particularly like what you're saying about Virginia Woolf, is just, it's so true. It's like you can see what almost you choose to see. And I would have had that impression of Virginia Woolf. I kind of did, that she was a little bit judgmental. But in fact, it sounds like she more had this wicked sense of humor. But you talk about, how big of a heart she has. I mean, it's a slight diversion, but you have a new project afoot with Virginia Woolf's house, the Monk House. Can you talk about that a little bit?
It's incredibly exciting, and it's just so a great pleasure for me because I'm now going to be working for the National Trust, doing detailed research for a conservation plan into Woolf's house and really looking at each of the changes that she made to the spaces around her and the objects she collected, all of which are so expressive of her work and the journeys went on, because every change she made to her home and every piece of art that she commissioned was funded either by the books that she had written or the books she was publishing through the Hogarth Press. So you can trace each of the journeys. I mean, there were areas of her house that was specifically funded through the publication of Orlando, or money that she was earning from publishing Vita's books, like the Edwardians. And I think that will be a treat to unravel each of those connections.
That just sounds like such fun.
Mm-hmm.
And you say she was very generous in supporting these, the young Bloomsbury folk.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, again, she took on a really parental role, because if you think she was employing members of Young Bloomsbury at the Hogarth Press, so she employed Rafe Partridge, she employed Angus Davidson, who was Duncan Grant's lover, she employed Dadie Rylands, who was an academic who became, again, a core member of Young Bloomsbury, and the list goes on. She was not only employing people in the press, but she was then publishing their work. She published Dadie Rylands' first book of poetry, which was called Russet and Taffeta. Rylands was one of the most beautiful young men ever existing, photographed by Cecil Beaton as the Duchess of Malfi. And I think, again, you just look at the images, and here are these non-binary identities absolutely expressive. And here was Virginia helping them on their way, both in employing them, publishing them, thinking about new work. And I mean, I really admire what she was doing in helping to develop their careers and nurture their lives. And I think there's a really wonderful passage from her diary that, well, actually, no, sorry, it's from her letters, that often has been, I think, almost taken for granted. There's a lovely description that she gives where she throws a party in June 1925 with her sister-in-law Karen Stephen in Gordon Square, and she invites lots of the young members of the Young Bloomsbury Group, specifically a young man called Philip Ritchie, to tempt Lytton, and she asks them all to come in white tie and tails. And then there's just a throwaway line towards the end where she said, and when the music started, all the young men began waltzing round the room in each other's arms, while the young women flirted with each other in corners. And this, she just takes it for granted that here you have this lovely scene of what I describe as sort of queer acceptance, because you would expect the young men to dance with men and the women to talk with women. But this was in a period where the Home Secretary was asking the police in London to crack down on what he described as acts of public indecency. So you could be arrested and imprisoned if you were a man dancing with a man. And at almost exactly the same time as these young men were twirling around the drawing room in Gordon Square, there was a young dancer called Bobby Britt a few streets away in Fitzroy Square, and he was in a basement flat, and the police could see in through his windows, and they could see men dancing with men. They raided his flat, they arrested him, and he was sent to 3 months penal servitude. So it just gives you this, you know, this terrible knife edge that people were on. You could be having this wonderful accepting time with Virginia in Gordon Square, and Fitzroy Square, you could be being arrested. And I think that, again, shows the important role that Virginia and others played in providing safe spaces for people at that time.
Oh, gosh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, it, you know, we have a little bit of that kind of strange dichotomy now that, you know, same-sex marriage is legal. However, in Missouri, where I live, you can be fired from your job for being gay. So, and that's happened where, you know, someone teaching at a parochial school marries his partner over the weekend and reports for work as the music teacher and gets fired. So yeah, it's so interesting how similar the kind of the situation is, but it's so extraordinary how the Bloomsbury Group they're just such an extraordinary example and an inspiration in so many ways. And as you were saying earlier, all the culture that we have, that the fertile world that came from is, you know, really creating that safe space. Like these folks could explore their much more of their potential, their full potential, because they had that space to play and be themselves.
Yeah, and again, looking at, I mean, I think coming back to Woolf and thinking of the role she played, not only in nurturing sculptors like Stephen Tomlin, who then produced what became her best-known image and is then in galleries throughout the UK, on the pedestal in Tavistock Square, and writers like Julia Strachey, whose book Cheerful Weather for the Wedding, again, she produced through the Hogarth Press. What you're doing is being able to support people who might not find support elsewhere. And there's this, as you say, it's extraordinary that here we are 100 years on and many things have moved forward, but some things haven't changed as much as we might have hoped they would. And obviously it depends where you are in the world right now as to whether any of these ways of living could be allowed in 2020 as they were in 1920.
Yeah. Wow. So how is the book being received on your side of the pond, other than within the, group of folks that were, they're their families?
Yeah, I've been really heartened, actually, because I was very nervous, as you can imagine, because this is an area that has been written about by many people. So I was worried that the literary critics might tear me apart and the popular press might equally have an angle. But actually, it's been very encouraging that I've had a lot of support from, whether it's the Times Literary Supplement or the Spectator, and analysing, responding to the book in its history of Bloomsbury, but also from places like the Daily Mail, which is quite a right-wing British press with very large circulation, and they put me with a heading in red saying "Lashings of Lust." I said the bright young things of the 20s were 100 years of their time. And actually went on to talk very positively about trans and non-binary people. But if it's 100 years ago, then it's fine to be talking about identities and how they could be expressed and the joy of clothing, whatever. And it's really interesting the way that journalists who might find such things triggering when talking about it today, if you're talking of a context of 100 years ago, then it's fine.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and you said that the conservative press said they were 100 years ahead of their time. And, I had been thinking about that, which I mentioned in an email with you, that were they really ahead of their time, or really were they of their time? That maybe that others were behind the time, because this is sort of, modernity happening and so much other kinds of change, just everything, like automobiles, I mean, electricity, all the things that were just the life that was happening before. It was nothing like what it was then. And yeah,
I think the 20s are really, I mean, again, it'd be interesting to reflect whether people in the future say the same thing about the 2020s, but in the 1920s, you had this strange dichotomy. As you say, you've got all this extraordinary new technology, you've got the jazz age appearing, you've got the great fun, the development of, cocktails and makeup, and the telephone, being able to speak to each other, immediately. And yet in Britain, certainly, you had a conservative government running from 1924 to 1928, who were very much wanting to crack down on all these new trends. I mean, particularly dangerous things like nightclubs, which absolutely needed to be suppressed if you could. And you had a Home Secretary called William Johnson Hicks, who was encouraging, as I said, the police out onto the streets to suppress acts of indecency. And you had things like the prosecution of Radcliffe Hall's Well of Loneliness for obscenity. And so you had this, back and forth between the forces of conservative reaction and all these new movements thinking about new ideas, new technology, new ways of being. And Bloomsbury was right in the middle of that tension, between these two different forces. Yeah.
It's remarkable. I know that Shane has flashed on the screen about people asking questions, and I hope they won't be shy and put your questions in the comment field. It doesn't matter what they might be. There's just so many possibilities because, my gosh, we're talking about some of the most amazing people of the 20th century, and there's a lot of them. And I know if you're watching this, you've probably got somebody, mine was Virginia Woolf, that you fixated on and read everything about. So you may have a question. Don't be shy.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, we have all these characters, who were particularly the founding members of the Bloomsbury Group. I mean, we've touched on Woolf, obviously. We've touched on Lytton Strachey, but obviously there's E.M. Forster and his extraordinary range of books, and indeed pioneering work in publishing. Morris obviously couldn't be published in his lifetime, but was published, after his death. So would have been illegal during his lifetime. And you have the extraordinary economist Maynard Keynes, who again is back in fashion right now. And then the artists Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant. So a real, smorgasbord of creative talents.
So many.
Yeah.
So that does kind of lead into my question, because of course we're talking about books and we're talking about book selling, fashion. And so I did want to remind everyone that we do have copies available for sale at Left Bank Books, left-bank.com, and I'll share the link again in just a moment. But for both of you, so say maybe I have not read a ton outside of dabbled with some Virginia. If I like a little bit of scandal, what would you recommend to me for my next book in the Young Bloomsbury group?
Wow. I have to say, I mean, I'm afraid I would go for the obvious one every time, although you may have read it already, which is just Orlando, because it is just the most extraordinary, wild roller coaster of a journey. And again, so relevant today, and not least on the London stage right at the moment, where we have the first non-binary actor playing Orlando on the London stage right now. It's sort of nearly 100 years after the book was written. So I'd go for Orlando as my top choice.
It's a fantastic choice. And if you haven't read, as you pronounce it, Morris, I would think say Maurice, but
that's exactly what I think. It goes either way.
There's that as well.
I honestly can't wait to pick up your book and read it, Nino, because it sounds like it will fulfill a lot of my scandalous needs.
Well, it certainly has some fantastic descriptions of amazing parties attended by a really stellar lineup of people. So,
and we're also really lucky to have had incredible imagery, because Cecil Beaton, the photographer, was great friends with many members of, particularly of the Young Bloomsbury Group. And there are an extraordinary group of photographs, which again, you look at them with a 21st century eye, and you think, my God, how did people not recognize what was being expressed in these images? Particularly, there's a beautiful series of photographs taken in 1927 of the artist Stephen Tennant with his group of friends, all dressed as shepherds and shepherdesses. And actually, when you look at the costumes, all the costumes are ungendered. I mean, they are all, whether they are assigned male or female, the clothes are all the same. And if it's anything, those who are more masculine look more elaborate because they've got makeup on, whereas actually the clothing is identical. And you have these wonderful figures skipping through the fields, holding little wicker baskets and shepherd's crooks, and just looking absolutely amazing. And I would have loved to have been there that day.
I still don't have any questions from the audience. I know they're there, but maybe they're just really enjoying the questions that you have, Kris. So if you have more questions, we have a little bit of time left.
Well, yeah, and again, don't be shy, folks. But I know you've already brought so many anecdotes forward from the book that you were discoveries, but that, when you were researching this, first of all, I can't imagine how you kept that much documentation straight. But other than that, some of the surprises, like, tell us some surprises.
Well, I think what's been so lovely about being in contact with so many relatives of those of who I've been writing about in the book, also within my own family, is that many of them will have material that will just be potentially lying about on shelves or tumbling out of books. I mean, certainly most of the books on my shelves have letters tucked in front, and you never quite know what new thing you might discover within each, and those will then lead you down a research trail. And it's been extraordinary to have these little vignettes into the world each time, and sometimes it comes through oral history even, because there are some things that have been passed down in families that would not be known otherwise. I mean, even for example, talking within my own family, the writer Julia Strachey, for example, it wasn't until exploring that oral history that we discovered her Anglo-Indian heritage, and how that had come through in the artwork that Dora Carrington had painted of her, so that almost these were unspoken about things that were coming through and expressed in the way that those who were seeing and describing her. And so there were new discoveries around every corner.
Wow. Yes, you do write about her in the book, and the suppressed story of her maternal side, and then the semi-scandalous when it came to light in certain areas. But that's so interesting.
And I think, I mean, again, just to see the way that she was portrayed by Dora Carrington and also by Duncan Grant, and how those, that personal family story came through in her book, Cheerful Weather for the Wedding, which was published by Woolf. And Woolf was really admiring of her writing style. She writes about this a young bride, but you imagine it's going to be, a job, well, as you say, a cheerful event. And in fact, the bride is drinking herself into stupor to suppress the misery of the wedding, and she spills ink on her wedding dress during the day, and you discover that she had got pregnant the previous year with twins and had abandoned those twins in Albania, and that her lover has turned up at the wedding, and she is having to think about the children that she's abandoned before going off into this new man. And that actually was replicating a personal story that Julia was familiar with, because her own mother had abandoned, or was going to abandon, an illegitimate child when, and Julia had been with her when it happened. So just extraordinary range of personal stories all coming through in the literature.
And that's not something, that kind of story about women and marriage is not common fare to be published at that time. That's pretty transgressive in and of itself,
I think. And obviously it was something that intrigued Woolf as a subject, and something that she wanted to make sure was published, and she encouraged Julia to do it, although she said that it was almost impossible to get the book out of Julia because she was a typical Strachey and as slippery as an eel. She had
a way of saying things, Virginia Woolf.
I love it. Actually, Julia was just as bad. Julia was very naughty because she liked to tease Virginia, and she said something absolutely terrible about her books, which she said that Virginia Woolf's novels dribbled on like diarrhea. I think it's a really...
Ouch.
I think she meant it as a joke. I don't think she did, but it was.
Yeah.
I do have another question. So the book has been out in the world for a little bit of time, and I'm curious if you have had anyone reach out with new information or stories that you maybe didn't find that are inspiring, like, or things that you wish you could have put in this book.
Yeah, and it's been really interesting in seeing the different responses from different journalists, and many of them have brought up. They haven't necessarily brought up new information, but have actually suggested new angles and new ways of looking at things. And I think one of the things that really made me sit up and think was Forbes magazine was looking at the relationship between the economics in the 20s and the way the young artists and writers were behaving, which wasn't an angle that I had necessarily thought about, in economic change being reflected in their behavior and their writing. So I think that is something that I might come back to think on, because they were really, looking at the way that the bright young thing was behaving and whether that was being sponsored by changing patterns in commerce. I don't think I've been given a totally new story yet, but certainly new angles and new interpretations.
The Charleston House. Am I right? That's the one that you've done some work with?
That's right. I'm a trustee at Charleston, which is Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell's house, which is an amazing combination of their artistic work. So you have almost every surface in the house painted by them. And what they have also is exhibition spaces there. So if you go to Charleston at the moment, there's an incredible exhibition of Duncan Grant's erotic drawings. And these were put together over his lifetime and include multiple groups of men in different positions and poses, and they're called, the exhibition is called Very Private because they were passed from Duncan to one of his friends and lovers, and then passed on from lover to lover, friend to friend, in a pattern of queer inheritance, which is something that also I came back to at the end of the book. These really interesting roots of where, often documentary evidence, or in this case artwork, will not necessarily be passing through biological descendants, but through relationship patterns. And that happens again and again in Bloomsbury and takes you down totally different and unexpected lines, and just shows you how important analysis of wills, for example, is in tracing those relationships and thinking who were really important to people. And often it was their chosen family necessarily rather than their biological family. And it's those routes down which works of art and works of literature have gone. And that was a joyous thing for me to follow. Yeah.
And Dora Carrington and how did you call it? The thruple. The thruple, as opposed to the couple. You wrote about that in the book, and that their home was a particularly active place. So many relationships and creative things happened there, and in way not what you would have thought if you thought of something 100 years ago.
Ham Spray, that was Lytton Strachey's house. And
yes.
Dora Carrington, just like Vanessa Bell at Charleston, Dora Carrington covered the entire interior of Lytton's home with murals and artworks. And Stephen Tomlin, the sculptor, was described as Lytton's sculptor in ordinary, because he was creating sculptures for the interior of the house, the garden, even sticking them on the outside of the building. And that's again, you can trace those inheritance patterns, because Lytton left he bought the building in Rafe Partridge's name, but he left all his money and all his works of art to Carrington. So those were absolutely passing through the throuple, and then went on through, after Carrington's tragic death, to Partridge and to Partridge's wife, Francis Partridge. And now you see, it's really interesting, those works of art coming through again, and some of them being lent to Charleston now, which were originally bought by Lytton. And you can trace each inheritance route that they followed.
Wow.
That's to go through. Yeah.
This is kind of how I imagine every time a writer tells me that they're going to like a writing retreat, I'm like, oof, this is the life that I imagine they're having in these retreats.
Yeah, no, I have to say, I wish I could have been at Hamsbury in the 20s when Lytton was throwing his extraordinary parties there, where everybody was encouraged to come dressed in a different gender to their assigned gender and to perform plays that he had written in order to explore different literary and other themes. And I just think it would have been, a wonderful place to be. Oh, and of course they made films as well. Of some of these, so you can actually look on YouTube and see somebody dancing on the lawns at Hamsbury.
Wow.
Right. Well, I want to thank both of you for this incredible, enlightening, more scandalous than I expected. Like, especially,
I know.
I was like, oh.
I've been telling our much younger staff, who are all very queer, holding up the book and saying, this is what this is about, and, non-binary and polyamorous, and, they're not, so it is there's a whole audience for this book, I think, that has yet to discover it. We'll do our job.
I want to share the link again. So reminder to everyone watching and everyone watching in the future, there is the link for how you can order the book from Left Bank Books. We do ship internationally if you would like. We ship all over the country. Our store is open for you to come in, browse our queer literature section, of which is all over the store, really. So you'll find queer literature kind of throughout. But really, I want to thank both of you. This conversation has been enlightening, entertaining, and I'm so glad that people were here to experience this with us. And I had a fantastic time.
As did I.
Oh, thank you, Kris. Thank you, Shane. It's been great to be with you tonight. Okay.
Thank you, Nino, and I hope you get some sleep.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Best wishes on all your new projects, and that the book may have a long shelf life.
Thank you.
And to everyone watching, I hope you'll join us again really soon. Have a fantastic rest of your evening, morning, wherever you are. I hope you have a good day. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.